Hey, what up folks, this is GK. So in this video, we're going to look at the AWS IAM, and this is a beginner tutorial. So if you are already working on IAM, whatever I'm going to cover in this video might be very basic for you. So I suggest this is only for the beginners or who are not aware of AWS IAM concepts. So in this video, I'm going to cover IAM concepts, and I'm also going to go through the demo through the AWS console, play around with the policies, and I'll give you some of the key concepts that you have to remember and some of the best practices that you should follow. All right, so with that, let's first understand what is IAM. So IAM is AWS Identity and Access Management web service. So that helps you to securely control access to your AWS resources. And I must tell you that IAM is the strongest point of AWS. If you have watched my previous videos on GCP, GCP has a different layout, the way you want to create a projects and folders and organizations. But in the terms of IAM, it is nothing comparable to AWS, because AWS is very strong in IAM. You can go to granular extent of defining the roles, policies, and restricting people and applications. All right, so before I go into some of the other concepts such as IAM users and roles and policies, so let's try to understand first what is authentication and authorization. I hope you all know what is AWS account. So you have created an account and you have access to that account. So there are EC2 and S3 or CFT or other bunch of AWS services that are existing in that account. So when you try to log in through the console of the AWS account and give your email address or password, the email address that you have used when creating the account, so that account is called the root user. So the root user basically is the main user, is a super admin or beyond super admin, because only this user can destroy an AWS account. So when a root user or any user would try to access AWS account, we enter username and password. So once you enter the correct username and password, you get access to the account, right? So you get into AWS console. So that is called authentication. So that's authentication. Now, after you log into the console, let's say you want to create an EC2, or you want to create a Lambda function, or you want to access certain objects inside an S3 bucket, you need permissions to do that. So you should be this user should be authorized to do certain operations, in EC2 or S3 or CFT or Lambda. So that's authorization. Once you're authenticated, obviously you need authorization to do certain actions inside AWS account. So that's authentication versus authorization. Another key term is IAM user. So what is IAM user? So IAM user is an entity that you create in AWS to represent a person or an application that uses it to interact with AWS. So let's say you have user, with permissions to access S3 buckets or create S3 buckets, all those things. So this IAM user will have access to AWS and will do certain operations which are assigned to that user. When your application from on-prem or from any other cloud or from anywhere is trying to access AWS, so that application will also use the IAM user. So IAM user need not be a person or a human being, but it can be an application that's going to use that user. So basically what's going to happen is, if you have an application that is running inside a VM which is on premise, right, and if this application has to access AWS, so you would create you create an IAM user here, and then you give access keys and secret keys. So you give a secret keys. It's like your service account keys in GCP, if you know GCP, but if you don't know, that's okay. So it's keys, it's like your password keys. So now this IAM user that would be used by the application to talk to AWS, to authenticate and to authorize to do certain operations, that operations like such as S3. In this case, if S3 is given to that user, and then this application will only do the S3 operations, so it cannot do anything else beyond that. So that is IAM user. So as a best practice, it is not advisable to create a lot of IAM users and keys, and we're going to discuss why we should not do that. So that's with IAM user. Now, so the other key concept is IAM role. So IAM role is an IAM identity again that you can create in your account that has specific permissions. So this is similar to your IAM user where you assign certain permissions to that user, but IAM role is not associated with a user, right? So it's not associated with a user or anybody else who's going to or with a person. So it can be assumed by anybody who needs to use the permissions that are assigned to that role. So when I'm using the word assumed, this means that this role can be assumed by a user as well, an IAM user, or this role can be assumed by an AWS service. Now I'll give you a scenario. So let's say you have an EC2, and this EC2 instance should access S3 buckets and objects of certain form of buckets, or it has to access only specific S3 buckets and objects. Let's say that you want to do. So what you would do is you would create an IAM role and you will give permissions to IAM role. We'll give set of S3 list or S3 read, etc. So we're going to give all those permissions to this IAM role, and then we're going to attach this role to the EC2 instance. So now this EC2 instance is assuming this role to do operations related to the S3 buckets and objects. Now in this case, an AWS resource or AWS service is assuming this role, right? And let's say a user is there, you have an IAM user. An IAM user wants to use this role. So in that case, what we would do is we would not give any permissions directly to the user, but we would give assume permissions, to assume a role, because user just cannot assume any role unless you give the permissions for that user to assume a role. So when we give assume role permissions, then user would assume this role and again access the same S3 objects or whatever permissions you give. So that's assume role. So these are the common scenarios that you would do in IAM role. And for more complex scenarios in general, what companies do is they use the federated permissions, like federated access. In a big organization, let's say there are 10,000 plus users in a company, you cannot give all the 10,000 users by creating IAM users and give them permission. So what you would do is you create an IAM role like admin or normal user, and then you give federated access by connecting your SAML provider, like your SiteMinder or whoever it is, and then you connect that with AWS. That's the complex scenario. We're not going to get into that, but that's how these IAM roles are used. These are the common use case of an IAM role. What is an IAM policy? IAM policy is nothing but it's a set of permissions that you define and attach to an IAM role or an IAM user. So IAM policy is a JSON document. The main thing that JSON will have is a statement, and inside the statement you have an effect. So effect is allow or deny, and action is like what actions you want to give permissions, like meaning S3 read or SQS delete message, in any such action, and then to which resource you want to give those permissions. So that's IAM policy, and you create IAM policies and you attach those IAM policies to IAM role or an IAM user. So in general, I think in the associate exam which I took it long back for AWS, They might even ask you in the exam by giving a specific policy document and asking you what would be the effect of that policy document. And groups are nothing but you maintain different IAM users in a specific group. If you have admin groups, you create multiple IAM users and you put that in a group. So you can create an admin group, and then you can create user 1 with permissions user 2 and user 3. So the advantage of this is like you can give permission directly to the group. You will give permission to the group directly, so that will be applied to all these users instead of giving each user IAM permissions individually. So that's group. So the other thing that I wanted to discuss was when I was talking about authorization. So let's say a user is created, an IAM user, and that user is trying to access AWS. And after authentication is done, a user is authenticated. So unless you give permissions to the user will not have access to any resources. So that is called implicit deny. Try to remember this, which is important. So implicit deny meaning implicitly the user will not have any permissions to AWS resources unless you give the permissions. Now let's say the user is given permissions, right? And then the user is given maybe S3 permissions or Lambda permissions or specific Lambda actions or etc. But user is denied to access, let's say CloudFormation. So user is denied to access that, right? So that's called explicit deny, right? So which means is that this user is explicitly denied to access certain AWS resource or a service. So that's called explicit deny. And if you have like IAM policies, like if you have 5 IAM policies in a role, or you have assigned 5 IAM policies to a user, if there is any deny, then user would be explicitly denied. Even if you give any allow statements, but user would be denied because deny will take more precedence over allow. If you do not give permission at all, then user would not have access to any service because user is implicitly denied. So that's difference between implicit deny and explicit deny. All right, so now I'm going to ask you a question and let me know in the comment section. So let's say that I gave a user permission to S3 to read objects. I gave a read permission to read all the objects in a specific bucket. Let's say the bucket name is bucket 1. I gave that permission to the user. But what I did was, in the bucket policy, I said this user 1 is denied to read. Let's say I gave set of IAM permissions here, IAM through IAM policy, and I gave some permissions in the bucket policy. So what will happen in this case? Yeah, you definitely see a conflict here between these two, right? So let me know in the comment section what do you think is going to happen, and feel free to do Google search on this. It's even more better if you play around in the console and try to come up with this scenario, and let me know in the comment section how it went. So with that, I'm going to go over the console. All right, folks, now I'm in the AWS console and I have logged in as a root user, but I highly recommend you guys not to do that. So as soon as you create an account, let's say a free tier account, or if you are working for a startup or any company, you should never use root user. So first things first, you create a root user. Obviously you have a root user, and then once you set the password, and always secure your root user with MFA, which is also called as multi-factor authentication, where you're going to use like Google Authenticator to have a random ID generator along with the password. Once you have these two things done, secure your root user somewhere, the password of your root user somewhere in in Vault or whatever service you use to store the passwords. Once that is done, what you would do is, after you log in as root, make sure you go to the user section and create a user. So I have created myself a user and I gave admin access to that user. So from here on, I ideally should log in as master GK, but somehow I forgot to do that, and I log in as root user, which I never recommend to anybody doing that. All right, so with that, I have come into the AWS IAM console. If you don't know how to do that, search here IAM console uh, or just IAM. Click on that. Now you see here we have groups, users, roles, and policies. In the groups, I have created an admin group, and whoever is going to be the admin, I'm going to assign that person to this group. And obviously I have assigned myself to the group. The permissions of an admin will have the default policy name. So AWS has created the manage default policies, so that you don't have to worry about adding specific permissions for specific things. For instance, administrator access, you have everything, I mean all access to all the resources and everything. So it's star dot star. So all you have to do is attach that administrator access policy, and once you attach to that, everybody who is part of this group would get access to the administrator access. I'm going to show you the policy. Okay, so I'm going to click on this. This is the policy. This is the IAM policy, and this is the JSON document that I was talking about. And here you see effect, action, and resource. So these three are the most important things to understand here. So effect meaning allow, like I was talking before, unless you put a deny here, you would be implicitly denied. And if you put a deny here, that is called explicit deny. But here for administrator, it's allow, and action is all actions, any possible action that you see. And resource is all resources, all the AWS resources. That's why it is star dot star. So administrator is almost equal to root, but only root user can delete an account. An administrator can never delete an account. So that's important to remember. Okay, so this is the policy usage, and attach this policy to IAM entity to apply its permissions. The policy versions, you can create multiple versions whenever you're making changes. It's like your Git version control for policies. So you can have up to 5 versions, and if you are crossing 5, you have to delete more versions. And Access Advisor is a amazing utility from AWS. It will tell you what are the resources that are accessed by me in the last 30 days, or some of the resources I haven't even accessed, which are accessed like 352 days ago, and these are the things that I've accessed maybe 30 days back. All right, so that's groups. And users obviously is users. I have created a user here for myself. And roles, I have bunch of roles that I have created. For example, GK SQS test. So as soon as I've created the role, I wanted to assign certain permissions to this role. And if you look at the first one, this is ARN, which is Amazon resource name, and AWS IAM, and this is the account number, which is the principal, and role. And so this whole thing is called role ARN, which is Amazon resource name. That's the path. And here I have attached all these permissions to the role. Now if I click on, let's say this one, and you can edit the policy here itself, by clicking on edit policy. Either you can use the visual editor, or you can click on JSON, which is easier if you got used to this, which is much easier than a visual editor. And then you can edit the permissions here, like for example, allow logs create group, this is for CloudWatch, and allow logs create log stream. So you can just put these two here itself, as long as you have the same resource. So that's that, and then click on cancel. Now if you go back to the role, The trust here is Lambda, Amazon, AWS.com, meaning that this role can be assumed by the Lambda service. So that's trust, and this is again very important to understand. As I was telling before, this role can be assumed now by a resource called Lambda. For example, if a user wants to use this role, then what you would do is, for master GK, I would create a policy here to assume the role, and then I'll give the role name, and then this user will assume that role and try to do operations. That way you can create as many users as possible, but you can control those user permissions through a role, and that's a best practice. All right, now if I have to create a sample policy, so let's say that I want to create a policy where I want to list all the S3 bucket objects or something like that. So you can use visual editor, because sometimes it's tough to know unless you are completely hands-on with this to understand what are the different permissions for S3 and all. But if you have any questions, you can always go to the AWS documentation and go through that to see all the all the permissions for that specific resource. So S3, search for S3 and you'll get the service name. And here, if let's say I want to give only read-only permissions or list permissions, list. And here also you can see list all my buckets or list buckets or list jobs, etc. So let's say I'll just leave it as default, leave it as so leave as it is here. And then here for the resource, you already have a bucket, then you would specify the bucket, or you can just do all resources. So now what will happen is, if I review the policy and call it as YouTube S3 list all, create policy. So this policy, when I'm attaching that to a user, let's say I'm going to create a user or to a role, anybody who is going to use this policy would list all the buckets inside this AWS account, because I gave resource star. So that means instead of accessing a specific resource, would access all the resources inside S3. Sometimes I think I goofed up when I was saying resource and somewhere I'm saying service. Just to clear the confusion, service is AWS services like Lambda and all those things, and resource is where you use a service and you create a resource. Like you have a bunch of EC2 instances which are called as resources. One other thing that you always have to remember is, whenever you're creating a policy, you should always follow concept called principle of least privilege, which is you would give permissions only that are required for that user. I know it's a painful thing sometimes, because you have to keep adding the permissions based on the user's request, but companies automate that part, and it's always better to do that instead of just for the sake of doing it. You would give star or all the resources, or all the services, actions and stuff. So that's a dangerous thing to avoid, because that gives a user wide access and more permissions that are not required for the user. Okay, so I wanted to keep this video short and simple for you all to get started with IAM, but I'm going to come up with more IAM and AWS security videos going forward. So I hope this is helpful to you all, for people who are beginning to learn IAM. And I gave you an assignment of working on S3 bucket policy and IAM policy. Let me know if you have any specific questions on IAM which I can help you with. If you like this video, give it a like and share it with your friends. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.